The dare lasted barely 10 seconds. 10 seconds that silenced an entire nightclub, froze the most dangerous man in the room, and turned a reckless moment of rebellion into something that would reshape two lives forever. Hilda J. Ross felt it immediately. The sudden shift in the atmosphere, the way the pulsing red neon seemed to pause as if the club itself had stopped breathing to watch. Her lips had pressed against his with bold defiance, her heart hammering against her ribs as she claimed her victory. Already pulling back, already ready to laugh it off and retreat to her friends with a story to tell. But Nikolai Volkov didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't even flinch. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes studying her face with the intensity of a predator who had just discovered something unexpected in his territory. The tribal tattoos covering his neck and arms seemed to pulse in the crimson lighting, and his hands, large, controlled, dangerous, remained at his sides even as every instinct screamed that this man was not someone you touched without permission. The crowd around them had gone silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the bartender had stopped pouring drinks, sensing that something significant had just shifted in the balance of power. When Nikolai finally spoke, his voice was low, accented, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "You should be more careful who you let dare you into dangerous games, little artist." The way he said it, not angry, not amused, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly how dangerous those games could become, sent ice through Hilda's veins. This wasn't just any man. This was someone who commanded fear and respect without asking for either. As he turned and walked away, the crowd parting like water before him, Hilda realized with crystal clarity that her reckless dare had just introduced her to a world where kisses weren't just kisses. They were declarations of war, claims of territory, and sometimes the first move in a game where the stakes were higher than she could possibly imagine. But even as her friends pulled her toward the exit, even as her rational mind screamed warnings, Hilda couldn't stop herself from looking back. And when she did, she found Nikolai Volkov watching her from across the room, his dark eyes promising that this was far from over. The kiss had lasted 3 seconds. The consequences would last a lifetime. Hilda woke to sunlight streaming through her apartment windows and the immediate, crushing weight of what she'd done. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, a symphony of notifications that made her stomach clench with dread and something else she couldn't quite name. Exhilaration, maybe. The dangerous kind that came from jumping off cliffs without checking the water below. The first photo made her breath catch. There she was, bold as brass, kissing a man who looked like he could command armies with a single glance. Nikolai Volkov's face was unmistakable in the red neon lighting, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to see straight through the camera, and an expression of controlled intensity that made her pulse quicken even 12 hours later. The tribal tattoos covering his neck and arms were clearly visible, marking him as someone who belonged to a world she'd only seen in movies. Her friends had captioned the photos with fire emojis and shocked face reactions. "Girl, who is he? You kissed a literal god. That man looks dangerous." Dangerous. The word echoed in her mind as she scrolled through image after image. In every single one, while she looked flushed and reckless, Nikolai appeared completely in control. A man who had allowed something to happen rather than been surprised by it. Hilda spent the morning trying to lose herself in work, sketching designs for a new client's logo with hands that trembled slightly every time she remembered the way he'd looked at her. Like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. The rational part of her brain insisted she should forget the entire incident, chalk it up to too much wine and peer pressure, and never think about mysterious, tattooed strangers again. That plan lasted exactly until 2:47 p.m. when her building's buzzer rang. She almost didn't answer, almost pretended she wasn't home. But something, curiosity, recklessness, or maybe the same impulse that had made her accept the dare in the first place, made her press the intercom button. "Miss Ross." The voice was unmistakable, accented and calm. "I believe we have something to discuss." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "How did you find my address?" "I find what I need to find." "May I come up?" Every instinct screamed that she should say no, should hang up and pretend this conversation never happened. Instead, she heard herself saying 5th floor, apartment 5B. When she opened her door 3 minutes later, Nikolai Volkov stood in her hallway looking like he belonged there, composed, patient, and somehow making her small apartment building feel like his personal domain. He wore a simple black shirt and dark jeans, but the way he carried himself suggested this was a man accustomed to being obeyed. "One dinner," he said without preamble. "That's all I'm asking." Hilda stared at him, torn between fascination and terror. Why? His dark eyes studied her face with the same intensity she remembered from the night before. "Because you kissed me like you meant it, and I want to know why." The honest answer terrified her. But curiosity had always been her weakness. "Okay," she whispered. "One dinner." The restaurant didn't have a sign. Hilda noticed that immediately as Nikolai's black sedan pulled up to a nondescript building in Lower Manhattan. The kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without realizing it existed. But the moment they stepped inside, she understood why discretion mattered. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables spaced far enough apart for private conversations. The clientele looked expensive. Men in tailored suits speaking in hushed tones, women dripping in jewelry that caught the light like captured stars. This wasn't just exclusive, it was the kind of exclusive that required connections money couldn't buy. The maitre d' approached them with the careful deference of someone greeting royalty. "Mr. Volkov, your usual table is ready." Hilda watched the interaction with growing unease. The staff moved around Nikolai with nervous efficiency. Not the eager-to-please energy of servers hoping for good tips, but the careful attention of people who understood consequences. When the sommelier presented a wine bottle for approval, his hands trembled slightly. "You come here often," Hilda observed once they were seated at a corner table that offered clear views of both entrances. "Privacy matters in my line of work." Nikolai's dark eyes studied her face as he spoke. "Which brings us to why we're here. I thought we were here because I kissed you. You kissed me because your friends dared you to kiss the most dangerous-looking man in the room." His voice carried no judgment, only statement of fact. "The question is whether you understood what dangerous actually meant." Hilda set down her wine glass, meeting his gaze directly. "What do you do, Nikolai?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he leaned back in his chair, and she caught a glimpse of the tattoos extending beneath his shirt collar, intricate designs that looked less like decoration and more like a language she couldn't read. "I inherited a family business that operates outside the law," he said finally. "Import, export, territory management. The kind of work that requires unconventional methods." The words hung between them like a challenge. Hilda felt her pulse quicken, but not with fear. With the same reckless curiosity that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. "Are you telling me you're a criminal?" "I'm telling you I'm trying to change that." His accent thickened slightly, the only sign of emotion. "But change takes time, and some things can't be undone overnight." "Are you dangerous?" Nikolai was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but absolute. "To my enemies, yes. To you, never." The certainty in his tone should have frightened her. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through her chest, the recognition that this man, who commanded fear and respect from everyone around him, was promising her safety. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you deserve to know what you're walking into." His dark eyes never left hers. "And because I want you to choose to stay anyway." The note was waiting on Hilda's desk when she arrived at her studio Monday morning, placed precisely in the center of her workspace like a calling card. Plain white paper, block letters written in black ink. "Pretty girls who play with fire get burned. Stay away from what doesn't belong to you." Her hands shook as she read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less threatening. But the message remained clear, and the implications made her stomach clench with ice-cold fear. Someone had been in her private workspace. Someone knew about Nikolai. She called him without thinking, muscle memory dialing the number he'd given her at dinner. He answered on the first ring. "Hilda." His voice was sharp, alert. "What's wrong?" "There's a note. Someone was in my studio." The words tumbled out in a rush. "They know about you. About us. Don't touch anything else. I'm coming." The line went dead, leaving her alone with the threatening message and the sudden, crushing realization that her reckless kiss had consequences she'd never imagined. She backed away from her desk, scanning the familiar space that now felt violated and dangerous. Her paintings, her sketches, her carefully organized supplies, everything looked the same, but the knowledge that hostile eyes had surveyed her private world made her skin crawl. Nikolai arrived in less than 10 minutes, bringing with him two men who moved with the fluid efficiency of trained professionals. They swept through her studio like shadows, checking windows, examining locks, photographing the note from multiple angles. Hilda watched from the doorway, feeling like a stranger in her own space. "How did they get in?" she asked when Nikolai approached her, his face grim. Lock was picked. Professional work. His dark eyes scanned her face, cataloging her fear with the same intensity he'd shown at dinner. "This is what I was afraid of." "Who would do this?" "People who see you as leverage." He moved closer, his presence both comforting and terrifying. "My enemies understand that the fastest way to hurt me is through someone I care about." The admission hung between them, someone I care about. 3 days ago, she'd been a stranger who kissed him on a dare. Now she was apparently important enough to target. "What do they want?" "To scare you away from me." Nikolai's voice carried quiet fury. "To make you understand that being close to me comes with a price." Hilda stared at the note, then at the men efficiently securing her studio, then at Nikolai's face, controlled but watchful, protective but dangerous. Every rational instinct screamed that she should run, should disappear back into her safe, ordinary life before this escalated further. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "Well, they're going to be disappointed." Something shifted in Nikolai's expression, surprise, admiration, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "You're not afraid?" "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm not running." The text started the morning after the note incident. Not overwhelming floods of messages, but careful, measured contact that felt like breathing room instead of suffocation. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" A photo of his coffee cup next to a newspaper. Simple things that somehow carried weight. Hilda found herself looking forward to them, the way Nikolai never demanded immediate responses, never pushed for more than she was ready to give. He asked about her work, remembered details from their conversations, sent her articles about art exhibitions he thought she'd find interesting. It was courtship in the old sense, patient and deliberate. 2 weeks after the restaurant, he invited her to his penthouse. The building rose above Manhattan like a steel and glass monument to power, all clean lines and understated luxury. Security nodded respectfully as they passed, but their deference felt different now, protective rather than fearful. His apartment was a revelation. Minimalist but warm, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look like a living painting. What surprised her most was the kitchen. Clearly used, lived in, with the kind of equipment that suggested someone who actually cooked rather than simply ordered in. "You're staring," Nikolai observed, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator with practiced efficiency. "I didn't expect you to cook." "My grandmother insisted I learn," said a man who couldn't feed himself was useless. His accent thickened slightly when he mentioned family, and Hilda caught a glimpse of the boy he'd been before power and violence shaped him. He moved through the kitchen with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else, but there was something almost meditative about watching him work. "No guastimotion, no hesitation." When he handed her a glass of wine, their fingers brushed, and she felt that familiar electric current. "Tell me about your businesses," she said, settling onto a bar stool. "The legitimate ones." Nikolai's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "Construction, mostly. Some import logistics. I've been expanding those operations, transferring other responsibilities to trusted people." "Other responsibilities?" He met her gaze directly. "The parts of my inheritance that operate in gray areas. I'm stepping back from active involvement." "Why?" The question hung between them as he plated their dinner with careful attention to detail. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet but certain. "Because I want to be the man who deserves you, not the one who endangers you." The honesty in his words hit her like a physical force. This wasn't just about attraction or chemistry. Nikolai was systematically dismantling pieces of his life to make room for her in it. "That's a big change," she said softly. "You're worth a big change." The certainty in his voice made her believe him. Hilda's apartment felt different with Nikolai in it. Smaller, somehow, but also more alive. As if her carefully curated space had been waiting for someone who understood the weight of creating sanctuary. He moved through her rooms like he was memorizing them, studying her paintings with the same intensity he'd shown that first night at the club. "You painted this?" He stood before her largest canvas, an abstract piece in deep blues and silver that she'd worked on for months, never quite satisfied with the result. "It's not finished." She joined him, suddenly self-conscious about the uneven brushstrokes, the places where she'd scraped away paint in frustration. "It feels like peace," he said quietly, and something in his voice made her look at him instead of the painting. His dark eyes held an expression she'd never seen before. Longing, maybe. Or recognition of something he'd forgotten existed. They sat on her small couch, close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the controlled energy that seemed to radiate from him even in stillness. The tribal tattoos on his arms were visible beneath his rolled sleeves, intricate patterns that told stories she was only beginning to understand. "Tell me about your world," she said. "The real one, not the sanitized version." Nikolai was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her coffee table. "I grew up believing that power meant control, that respect came through fear. My father taught me that caring for someone made you weak, gave your enemies a target. And now I think he was wrong about everything that mattered." He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his expression made her breath catch. "I've spent weeks dismantling pieces of my life, Hilda. Transferring operations, cutting ties, legitimizing what I can, and walking away from what I can't. My lieutenants think I've lost my mind." "Have you?" A smile ghosted across his lips. "Probably. But for the first time in my life, I'm choosing what I want instead of what's expected of me." The weight of his words settled between them. She understood what he was telling her, that he was reshaping his entire existence around the possibility of them. It should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel powerful in a way she'd never experienced. When she kissed him, it was her choice, her decision to close the distance between them. Nikolai responded with careful intensity, his hands gentle but certain as they mapped the curve of her spine, the line of her jaw. There was nothing hurried about the way they came together, just the slow, inevitable pull of two people who had been circling each other for weeks. Afterward, as they lay tangled in her sheets, Nikolai traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "This feels like home," he whispered against her hair. Hilda smiled, understanding finally that they both craved the same thing, not just passion, but peace. The meeting was held in a private dining room above a Russian restaurant in Brighton Beach, where the smell of borscht and cigarette smoke had soaked into the walls over decades of similar conversations. Nikolai sat at the long table surrounded by men who had known him since childhood, men who had watched his father build an empire and expected his son to maintain it without question. Viktor Petrov, his father's oldest friend and the closest thing to a patriarch the organization had left, leaned back in his chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You've been making changes, Nikolai. Transferring operations, legitimizing businesses. Some of the men are concerned. The men will adapt." Nikolai's voice carried no room for negotiation. "I'm transitioning to legitimate operations exclusively. Effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Cigarettes burned forgotten in ashtrays. Glasses of vodka sat untouched. These were men who had built their lives on the understanding that family loyalty was absolute, that the organization came before personal desires. And the reason for this sudden evolution? Victor's tone was deceptively mild, but Nikolai caught the steel beneath it. "I've found something worth more than power. A woman." It wasn't a question. Victor had sources everywhere, eyes that saw everything. This artist, Hilda Ross. Hearing her name in this room, spoken by these men, made something dangerous shift in Nikolai's chest. But he kept his expression neutral, controlled. "Yes. You would abandon your father's legacy for a woman you've known for weeks?" "I would choose my own future over his past." Nikolai met each man's gaze in turn, letting them see the finality in his decision. "The transition is not negotiable. I'm naming Dmitri as my successor for territorial operations. The legitimate businesses remain under my control." Victor's laugh was cold. "Your father would be ashamed. My father is dead." The words cut through the room like a blade. And I refused to die with him. The threats came then. Veiled references to loyalty, to consequences, to the price of abandoning family. But Nikolai had expected this, had prepared for it. When he finally stood to leave, the weight of their disapproval followed him like smoke. He drove through the city in silence, the familiar streets blurring past as he processed what he'd just done. 34 years of conditioning, of duty, of inherited obligation, all of it sacrificed for the possibility of something real. Hilda was waiting in her apartment, curled on the couch with a book, looking up when he entered. The contrast hit him like a physical blow, the peace in her eyes versus the violence he'd just left behind. "How did it go?" she asked softly. Nikolai crossed to her, pulled her into his arms, and buried his face in her hair. "It's finished," he said against her skin. "I chose you over everything." 3 months later, Hilda's life had acquired a rhythm she'd never expected. Coffee shared in comfortable silence, Nikolai's presence at her gallery openings, the way he listened when she talked about color theory and composition like it was the most important thing in the world. He integrated into her world with the same careful precision he brought to everything else, but there was something different about him now. Softer around the edges, though no less formidable. Her friends had been skeptical at first. Sarah, her closest friend since college, had pulled her aside after meeting Nikolai at a dinner party. "He's gorgeous, obviously, but there's something intense about him. Like he's always watching the exits." "He is," Hilda had admitted. "But not because he's planning to leave."
And it was true.
Nikolai's vigilance had nothing to do with escape routes and everything to do with protection. He noticed things. Who entered a room, which conversations stopped when they approached, the way certain people looked at Hilda when they thought he wasn't watching. But he did it all without making her feel caged or controlled. He came to her art shows, standing slightly apart from the crowd but close enough that she could feel his presence like an anchor. When a collector made an offer on one of her paintings, a significant one that would help her quit her part-time design work. Nikolai's pride was quiet but unmistakable. "You're brilliant," he told her afterward, his accent thick with emotion. "Watching people discover what I already knew, it's extraordinary." The changes in him were subtle but profound. The man who had once commanded through fear now asked her opinion on everything from restaurant choices to business decisions. He cooked for her regularly, his grandmother's recipes becoming their shared language of intimacy. When she worked late in her studio, he would sit nearby reading, content to simply exist in her space. One evening in early spring, as they cleaned dishes together in her small kitchen, Hilda found herself studying his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his tattoos disappeared beneath his shirt collar, the careful way he dried her grandmother's china. "Move in with me," she said suddenly. Nikolai's hand stilled. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain I want to wake up next to you, every morning. I'm certain I want this to be our space, not just mine." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll bring what matters." When he moved in the following weekend, he arrived with surprisingly little: clothes, a few books, a photograph of his grandmother, and a small wooden box that he placed carefully on her dresser without explanation. Everything else, he said, belonged to a life he was finished living. That night, lying in their bed, Hilda realized that home wasn't a place anymore. It was the steady rhythm of his breathing, the protective weight of his arm around her waist, the quiet certainty that they had chosen each other completely. A year later, Nikolai came home with a small velvet box and the quiet certainty of a man who had finally learned the difference between taking what he wanted and earning what he needed. Hilda was curled on their couch, sketching in the golden light of late afternoon, her hair falling in waves around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression made her set aside her work. "What is it?" she asked, though her eyes had already found the box in his hand. Nikolai didn't kneel, didn't stage a moment or craft a speech. He simply sat beside her, close enough that their knees touched, and opened the box to reveal a ring that was perfect in its understated elegance, a single diamond that caught the light like captured starfire. "You saved me," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Not by trying to change me, but by seeing who I could become and believing I was worth the wait." Hilda's breath caught, her eyes moving from the ring to his face. In the year they'd been together, she'd watched him transform. Not into someone different, but into who he'd always been beneath the armor of violence and control. The man who cooked her breakfast on Sunday mornings, who listened to her talk about color theory like it was the most important thing in the world, who had dismantled an empire piece by piece to build something better. I spent 34 years believing that power meant control, he continued, taking her hand in his. That caring for someone made you vulnerable. You taught me that real strength comes from choosing someone and letting them choose you back. Every single day. The ring slipped onto her finger like it had always belonged there. Perfect fit, perfect weight, perfect in its promise of permanence. Yes, she whispered, though he hadn't asked the question in words. They both understood what this was, not a performance or a tradition, but a recognition of what they'd already built together. They moved to the window, drawn by the lights beginning to twinkle across Manhattan as evening settled over the city. Nikolai's arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned into his warmth, watching their reflection in the glass. Two people who had found each other across impossible odds and chosen to stay. One reckless stare, Nikolai murmured against her hair, his voice filled with wonder at the path that had led them here. Hilda smiled, her hand covering his where it rested against her waist, the ring catching the city, lights like a promise. The best decision of my life. Outside, Manhattan hummed with endless possibility. Inside, they stood together in the quiet certainty of forever.